Imagine trying to build an army with loyal soldiers, matching uniforms, and regular pay. That was the challenge medieval kings faced, using oaths, money, and divine authority to hold everything together. But what truly drove men to march into battle? Kings in the Middle Ages did not simply wake up one morning and decide to invade a neighbor over breakfast. War was never a sudden decision. It required approval from one person whose word carried absolute power. Only the king could legally declare war and set a military campaign in motion. No noble, general, or church official could do it on their own. Yet kings rarely shouted their plans from the rooftops. They chose carefully who to inform and when, guarding their intentions like state secrets. Wise rulers knew that gossip could tip off enemies or allow rivals to strike first. Surprise was often their most valuable weapon. Most medieval kingdoms had no permanent armies at all. Kings did not keep thousands of men in uniform eating royal food and collecting wages year-round. Instead, they had to build a new force every time they wanted to fight. Imagine starting completely from scratch for every single war, recruiting, training, and organizing all over again. The closest thing to standing soldiers were the king's personal household knights. These warriors lived near the royal court, trained daily, and owed everything to the monarch's favor. Their loyalty was purchased through honor, housing, and steady rewards. They formed the hardened core of any army, but even the wealthiest rulers could only afford a few hundred of them. When a king made the decision to go to war, he set ambitious goals for troop numbers and sent out royal orders across his lands. These were not polite invitations. They were commands backed by severe consequences for disobedience. Local lords received their quotas and were expected to deliver. What happened if they refused depended on the king's mood and level of desperation. Some threatened to confiscate property, others imposed heavy fines, and a few simply arrived in person with troops to ensure cooperation. The process of assembling an army moved painfully slow. It could take months to gather enough men, especially if lords lived far from the royal court, or if agricultural work delayed recruitment. Kings quickly learned that timing was everything. Trying to raise an army during planting or harvest season was a disaster waiting to happen. Taking peasants away from their fields could spark rebellion and cripple food production. Success in medieval warfare depended less on numbers and more on persuasion. A king needed to convince the right people to fight for him. Getting them to actually appear, armed and ready, required balancing promises, threats, and payments across a vast network of loyalties. Once the royal command went out, it was like setting a chain reaction through the entire realm. This entire system ran on feudalism. Nobles did not receive their estates for free. They held them in exchange for military service. Think of it as paying rent, but with soldiers instead of coins. When war came, a noble's duty was to send knights to fight on the king's behalf. These knights were far from ordinary men. They began training in childhood, learning swordplay, horseback combat, and discipline in armor that could weigh nearly as much as another person. Their whole social identity revolved around being elite fighters. When summoned, each lord gathered his armed followers. Some arrived with only a few men, while others brought entire companies. The size of one's entourage displayed wealth and prestige, but there was a major catch. A knight's service was typically limited to about 40 days before he could demand payment or permission to return home. This 40-day rule was every king's nightmare. Just when an army was assembled and battle plans were ready, knights began announcing their time was up. They had fulfilled their duty and were eager to return to their estates. Imagine trying to launch a campaign when your soldiers had expiration dates printed on their service. Feudal armies were unpredictable and often frustrating to manage. Some lords arrived late, others brought fewer men than promised, claiming hardship or bad harvests. A few ignored the summons altogether, sending excuses or hoping to go unnoticed among the thousands who did show up. Everything depended on personal loyalty, family alliances, and shifting politics. A king might call for 10,000 men and receive 6,000, or sometimes more, if ambitious nobles saw a chance for fame and loot. This made medieval armies both powerful and unstable, filled with skilled fighters who served for limited periods and often followed their own agendas. And when knights were not enough to fill the ranks, kings turned to another source, the common people. 40 days of noble service might give a king a few hundred mounted warriors, but real battles needed thousands of bodies. That is when local officials were ordered to recruit from villages. These were not eager volunteers giving speeches about honor. They were ordinary peasants chosen by town leaders, often the youngest or poorest residents who could be spared. It was a harsh system, but it kept the king's war machine running, whether the people liked it or not. Enter the arrayers, royal officials who roamed the countryside like medieval recruiters. But instead of hunting talent, they searched for bodies to fill the ranks. They would arrive in a village, summon all able men, and begin selecting who would serve. Height mattered. Age mattered. Missing fingers or limbs were instant disqualifiers. But the method was anything but consistent. Most peasants showed up carrying whatever weapons they could find. Pitchforks, clubs, or perhaps an old sword handed down from a relative. The better off brought axes or spears, purchased from the local smith. As for armor, forget gleaming metal suits. Leather jerkins, thick wool, and padded cloth were the best most could afford. These were not seasoned warriors. They were farmers, millers, and craftsmen suddenly transformed into soldiers. Timing made a huge difference. Harvest season shaped everything. Before the crops were gathered, peasants resisted recruitment, unwilling to abandon their fields. But after the harvest ended, many joined willingly. Winter brought months of hard labor or idleness, and military service offered a way out. It promised food, travel, and perhaps even excitement. And for some, the hope of looting enemy lands was too tempting to ignore. Village politics often shaped who went to war. Petty feuds meant certain men were volunteered by neighbors eager to see them gone. Debtors, troublemakers, and the unpopular found themselves chosen more often than others. In some communities, small lotteries were even held to decide fairly who would march off. Peasant soldiers provided the numbers that noble knights could never match. A single shire might contribute hundreds of footmen to a royal campaign. These men became the core of medieval armies, the dense ranks that absorbed enemy charges and stormed fortifications through sheer determination. Yet their greatest strength came from desperation. They had little to lose and everything to gain from victory. While nobles fought for pride or honor, peasants fought for survival and spoils. Still, gathering these huge peasant levies created serious logistical challenges. Feeding, housing, and managing thousands of untrained men demanded skill and organization far beyond the basic act of recruitment. When feudal service and peasant levies fell short, kings turned to professionals. Mercenaries were a different breed. They fought not for faith or loyalty, but for money, and they charged a fortune. These were not aimless wanderers looking for quick pay. The best mercenary companies operated like businesses, complete with contracts, rules, and reputations to protect. The White Company in 14th century Italy, for example, fielded over 3,000 men and served across multiple regions. Their leader, John Hawkwood, became so rich he bought a castle and married into the nobility. Mercenaries often brought specialized skills that native troops lacked. English kings hired Genoese crossbowmen for their speed and precision. French rulers employed German pikemen who could stop charging cavalry in their tracks. Italian states preferred Swiss infantry for their discipline and unity. The cost was staggering. A veteran captain could demand the same wages a skilled craftsman earned in half a year. Multiply that by thousands of soldiers, and royal treasuries drained quickly. During one campaign of the 100 Years' War, King Edward III spent about £60,000 on mercenaries, enough to purchase entire towns. Then there was the problem of loyalty. Mercenaries followed whoever paid best. The same soldiers fighting for France in spring might fight for England by autumn if the gold was better. Some captains even collected pay from several rulers at once while avoiding real combat. It was clever business, though disastrous for strategy. Payment terms varied widely. Some demanded full wages in advance before marching. Others accepted land, captured goods, or shares of plunder as payment. Many contracts promised bonuses for victory and penalties for desertion. The most successful companies negotiated agreements that ensured they were paid even if the campaign failed. Royal treasurers hated these expenses, but kings kept hiring mercenaries because they worked. Professional soldiers brought discipline and experience that amateur forces could not match. Veteran crossbowmen could shatter an enemy line in minutes. Seasoned cavalrymen knew exactly when to strike and when to pull back. These were not farmers learning war on the spot. They were trained, battle-hardened professionals. Yet trusting outsiders who cared nothing for a kingdom's fate carried obvious risks. Still, when enemies fielded skilled armies of their own, kings had little choice but to meet them on equal footing. Not every man joined for gold, though. Some marched for something far more powerful than wealth. Spiritual promises and divine favor inspired entire generations to take up arms. When medieval rulers sought to move armies on a massive scale, they turned to their greatest ally of all faith in God. The Catholic Church did far more than pray for victory. It became an active recruiter, offering something no king on earth could promise: eternal salvation. The campaign began in 1095 when Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade. His message was a masterpiece of persuasion. Fight the unbelievers, reclaim the Holy Land, and your sins are forgiven. On top of that, your family receives legal protection, and all debts are suspended while you are away. For many, it was the ultimate bargain for picking up a sword. Bishops transformed into traveling recruiters, moving from town to town preaching the cause of holy war. They stood in busy marketplaces, delivering passionate speeches about faith, duty, and the defense of Christendom. The ceremony of taking the cross was full of drama. Men stitched red crosses onto their clothes, publicly declaring their vow to fight. Once you took that cross, backing out was forbidden. Anyone who tried faced excommunication from the church. Yet not everyone was driven purely by faith. Many believed in the cause, but others saw a path to glory, adventure, or wealth. Younger sons with no inheritance found opportunity. Criminals sought redemption and freedom from punishment. Poor peasants saw a chance at food, travel, and perhaps fortune. The call of the crusade attracted every type of person, from idealists to opportunists. The response was overwhelming. More than 100,000 people answered the first call. That number was greater than the population of most cities at the time. The crowd included noble knights in search of honor, merchants eager to open new trade routes, and countless peasants ready to exchange plows for weapons. Religious purpose created an enduring commitment. Mercenaries might desert if unpaid, and feudal knights might leave after 40 days. But crusaders felt bound to God's will. They crossed deserts, endured hunger, and survived sieges long after reason said to quit. Faith gave them strength that no earthly incentive could match. The church added even more rewards. Crusaders returning home gained special prestige, celebrated as heroes of the faith. Many told their stories for years, earning admiration in every tavern. Some were even buried with their crosses, a sign of their sacred service. But behind the sermons and blessings lay immense practical challenges. Crusading required huge resources: food, animals, weapons, and ships. The church collected donations, sold indulgences, and organized supply routes that rivaled the logistics of modern armies. Religious recruitment produced armies unlike any others in the Middle Ages. While feudal service and mercenaries created temporary forces, Crusades assembled fighters willing to die for their beliefs. Yet even the most faithful soldier needed proper gear, and this is where the high cost of war became impossible to ignore. Money ruled medieval warfare. Knights did not simply own fine armor by chance. That glittering metal protection cost more than most homes. A full set of plate armor equaled the price of a luxury vehicle today. Add the horse, weapons, and decorations, and the total rose even higher. Wealthy knights displayed their status through their equipment, while poorer soldiers made do with whatever they could find. The average peasant arrived with farm tools, turned into weapons. Sickles became blades, pitchforks became spears, and kitchen knives became daggers. A cracked wooden shield might serve as defense. Some truly went into battle carrying tools meant for fieldwork. Lords tried to supply their men with better weapons, but resources were limited. Kings often stepped in to provide uniforms, banners, and flags to keep their armies organized and recognizable. It was essential to distinguish friend from foe during chaotic battles. Then came the harsh mathematics of logistics. An army's size was not based on courage or patriotism, but on what the treasury could afford. Too many soldiers meant starvation as supply lines failed. Too few meant defeat against better-equipped foes. Every monarch faced the same impossible equation: how to field a powerful army without draining the kingdom dry. The expense was enormous. A single campaign could swallow half of a king's annual income. That figure only covered equipment and horses, not food, pay, or transport. Some rulers bankrupted themselves trying to fund larger armies. Edward III of England spent so much during his wars in France that he borrowed from Italian bankers and even pawned the royal jewels. Resourceful kings found creative solutions. They offered captured land instead of wages, shared war loot as incentives, or struck deals with wealthy merchants who financed campaigns in exchange for royal protection. This delicate financial juggling act often determined victory or defeat before a battle even began. Armies might never reach the battlefield if the money ran out first. Yet all the armor and equipment in the world meant nothing without proper training. Building an army was only step one. Most of the recruits had no experience fighting together. Knights were skilled fighters, trained since childhood. But the common man had rarely handled a real weapon. For him, the battlefield was a terrifying classroom, where lessons were learned in blood and chaos. Knights lived for the thrill of combat. They trained daily with real weapons, not wooden imitations, but genuine steel blades sharp enough to slice through armor and bone alike. Tournaments were far more than noble entertainment. They served as full-scale rehearsals for war, where knights learned to fight from horseback, deal with multiple attackers, and stay composed when death was only inches away. The wise treated every joust as preparation for the real thing. Then came the archers. English longbowmen began their training in childhood, starting with lighter bows until their muscles grew strong enough for the famous war bows of adulthood. By then, they could loose a dozen arrows in a single minute with lethal accuracy. The strain reshaped their very bodies. Skeletons found in old battlefields reveal that English archers developed enlarged arm bones and twisted spines from decades of drawing their powerful bows. It was the ultimate display of dedication. But that kind of discipline was rare. While knights and archers were highly skilled, most medieval armies also included thousands of raw recruits. Ordinary peasants who once plowed fields now found themselves gripping spears and shields, learning formation drills in just a few frantic weeks. Training camps became crash courses in survival. Mock battles helped commanders spot who could hold the line and who would panic at the first charge. Some men froze during practice cavalry attacks, which was exactly the point of those brutal rehearsals. Better to break in training than die in war. The armies were a strange mix. Hardened veterans who had seen 100 campaigns stood beside farmers who had never even held a weapon before. The seasoned warriors became informal instructors, teaching the basics of defense, timing, and controlled retreat. Camps roared with noise from marching drills, weapon practice, and shouted orders. Recruits learned to move as one solid mass instead of a chaotic mob. They practiced responding to horns and flags, drilled until every movement became instinct. The real question was never about skill, but about speed. Could they learn fast enough before the enemy arrived? Because once the march began toward hostile ground, the lessons stopped. Money fueled every step of that march, and keeping an army loyal required far more than courage. Medieval kings had to become part strategist, part accountant, and part manipulator. A soldier without pay was a soldier ready to turn on his master. Kings scoured every source of wealth they could find. Nobles were burdened with high taxes. Merchants saw their earnings vanish into royal treasuries, and towns paid dearly to avoid the chaos of garrisons stationed within their walls. Even the church, rich and powerful, had to hand over silver to support holy wars. Yet this often left rulers trapped by their own debts, fighting wars they could barely afford to win. Some kings realized that rewarding loyalty mattered more than victory itself. They lavished gifts on their most capable commanders, fine horses, jeweled weapons, and sometimes entire estates. Knights who displayed extraordinary valor received generous bonuses, while common soldiers shared the spoils of captured arms and armor. When an army triumphed, everyone benefited. Still, punishment was swift for those who faltered. A deserter could expect a public flogging or worse. Refuse the king's call to arms, and you risked imprisonment, loss of land, or the gallows. Military discipline in the Middle Ages was as harsh as the wars themselves. Lords who failed to send their required troops faced ruin, while generals bickered over prestige and position. Rival nobles used campaigns to settle old scores, forcing kings to manage egos as carefully as strategies. Betrayal was a constant threat in every royal tent. Edward II discovered this too late, when his own barons turned against him. Even victory brought new dangers. Soldiers who had tasted plunder expected more of it, and peasants who returned from war often refused to go back to simple labor. Knights developed expensive habits after years of conquest. The shrewdest rulers understood that armies were fragile alliances built on shared profit. Keep the rewards flowing, maintain fairness, and crush disloyalty without hesitation. That formula built kingdoms for centuries. Lose control of any part of it, and even the mightiest army could fall apart from within. Running a medieval army demanded the mind of an accountant, the instincts of a psychologist, and the will of a tyrant. Those who mastered all three forged empires. Those who failed were destroyed by their own men, learning the hard way that loyalty was always the most costly weapon of all.